truth to come out, and I'm hoping that they can do that, and I hope they find her, and that will help clear up all of.
The boat Lynette Hooker fell from is still there. It has been floating quietly in the same stretch of water where everything was supposed to have gone wrong. For days, search crews focused on the ocean, combing through clear, shallow water that should have revealed something. But up till now, nothing. And that has raised a question no one could ignore, that we all need an answer to. If she didn't vanish in the water, then where did she go? We monitor true crime stories that you shouldn't miss, bringing you the main parts other people may have missed. You should subscribe now so you never miss anything. This case began with a reported accident at sea. A woman disappears, but her husband survives. And the explanation seems straightforward, at least at first. But as search teams moved through the area, something didn't line up. The environment didn't match the story, the search results didn't match expectations, and eventually, the investigation itself took a different direction. In this video, we're going to follow that shift, step by step. From the moment the boat was found, to the point where investigators began asking a very different question. Not what happened in the water, but whether it happened there at all. Firstly, if you are just following this story, it happened within a short distance, not miles out into the open ocean, or some dangerous crossing between islands, just a small stretch of water, the kind you can look across and still see where you're going. That's where this story begins. Lynette Hooker and her husband Brian had spent part of their evening near Elbow Cay, a place known for its quiet shoreline, clear water, and steady flow of boats moving back and forth between land and anchored yachts. Their own yacht was sitting just offshore, visible, stationary, and close enough that the trip to it would normally take only a few minutes. And to get there, they always used a dinghy, a small boat designed for exactly this purpose, short transfers between shore and vessel. Stable, controlled. People make that trip every day. And on most nights, it passes without anything worth remembering. But according to the account given later, this night was different. Brian described the conditions as difficult. He spoke about wind strong enough to affect their movement. He said the water wasn't calm, it was unsettled, and that visibility dropped to darkness as daylight faded. In his version, the trip wasn't smooth, it wasn't controlled. He believed something about the environment made it unpredictable, the weather or the water. And somewhere during that short journey, he said Lynette fell overboard. Not in a way that gave him time to react. Suddenly, a moment that shifted from normal to irreversible. 1 second she was in the dinghy, the next she was in the water. And then, according to him, she was gone. He described trying to locate her. He looked back, he called out, but there was no response. He even threw in a board, but there was no Lynette or a struggle to make it out. And the conditions, he said, made it impossible for him. The light had faded, the water was difficult to see through. The situation was disorienting. He couldn't find her. At some point in that sequence, he said he lost sight of her completely. And once that happened, there was nothing left to track. No clear position, no fixed point, just open water. The timing placed this moment shortly before nightfall. That detail matters because it frames the environment in a specific way, a transition between visibility and darkness. Enough light to move, but according to his account, not enough to see clearly once something was lost, just darkness. And there's another detail in this version of events that you need to pay attention to. There were no witnesses. No one reported seeing the fall. No nearby boat confirmed the incident. No one on shore described hearing anything unusual, which means everything about that moment, the conditions, the sequence, the exact way it happened, comes from a single account. That account became the starting point, the foundation the search would be built on. And based on that foundation, the first assumption was straightforward. A tragic accident at sea, a fall during a routine trip, a failed attempt to recover, a disappearance into the water. This kind of explanation would fit easily, at least at first, because it doesn't require anything beyond what was described, just a moment of instability, followed by a loss that couldn't be reversed. But beneath that explanation, there's something else, the setting itself, because this didn't happen far offshore. It didn't happen in the deep, unpredictable ocean. It happened in a relatively contained stretch of water between a visible shoreline and a stationary boat. A space that's small enough to define and clear enough to observe. It is active enough that movement doesn't go unnoticed for long. And that's where we need to focus on. Because when something happens in a place like that, there's usually a trace, something that connects the moment to the environment around it, something that remains. But here, the story begins with total disappearance, one that happens quickly and completely, without any trace. And at this point, that account hasn't been challenged yet. It is simply sitting at the center of everything that follows, the last known position, defined not by what was seen, but by what was said. The more this account is examined, moments revisited, the more the environment around it starts to matter. Not just where it happened, but whether it fits. And that leads us to a very important question. That if Lynette Hooker fell in such confined and visible area of the water, why is there no immediate trace, even after days? Now, once Lynette was reported missing, the situation moved quickly, from a private moment on the water to a coordinated search across it. Authorities in the area began organizing almost immediately near Elbow Cay, not with uncertainty, but with a clear objective. Let's find her. At this stage, nothing about the case suggested anything beyond an accident. There was a fall into the water. There was a narrow window of time and a defined location, which meant the approach was focused, direct, and built around recovery. The first units to move in were boats. They didn't rush across the water. They slowed it down, scanning carefully, not just for a person, but for anything that might signal where to look next. A reflection, a movement, an object that didn't belong. Because in situations like this, the first discovery is rarely the final one. It's a starting point. So the boats moved in patterns, not random paths, but grids, straight lines drawn across the water, repeated with precision, each pass overlapping the last, each section accounted for. From above, it looked controlled, methodical, the kind of search that assumes something is there and just needs to be found. And below the surface, divers followed. This wasn't the deep open ocean. Much of this area sits between 5 to 15 feet in depth, shallow enough that, in many places, the seabed is visible, not in fragments, clearly visible, which changes how the search went. Divers weren't navigating blind spaces. They were moving through an environment where visibility, under the right conditions, could reveal shapes, outlines, disturbances. So, they moved slowly, carefully, watching for anything that interrupted the natural pattern beneath them. At the same time, aerial units entered the search. Drones, helicopters. From above, they provided a different perspective, one that could track movement across a wider area. But even that movement wasn't guesswork. It was calculated, because the search wasn't just about where Lynette was, it was about where she should be. And that's where drift patterns came in. Wind direction, current flow. Time passed since the reported moment, all of it used to project how something in the water would move. So investigators mapped it, If something entered the water here, then over time, it should move there, toward specific zones, edges where current slows, shallow areas where objects settle, shorelines where movement ends. And those areas became targets. Search grids were drawn tightly around the reported fall location first, because based on the original account, there was no reason to believe she had moved far. The environment didn't suggest rapid displacement, so the initial focus stayed close and precise. And for a while, that approach held. The assumption remained intact. She's in the water, she's nearby, and with these conditions, she should be found. Because the visibility here isn't typical. The water, even at the surface, allows you to see more than expected. Not perfectly, but enough. Enough that large objects, even smaller ones, don't disappear instantly. And that changes expectations. Because when visibility is high and depth is low, and the search is immediate, the window for recovery is usually short. Which is why, in those early hours, there was no shift in thinking, no alternative direction, no second theory. Everything pointed to the same outcome: find her in the water. And for a while, that expectation carried the search forward, boat after boat, pass after pass, divers covering the same ground from below, aerial units tracking movement from above, all of it working together, focused on a single assumption. But then, time passed, and the first pass ended. Nothing. So they ran it again. Second pass. Same area, same patterns, same expectation, still nothing. At that point, it wasn't unusual yet. Searches often take time, so the process continued, carefully, systematically. But with each pass, something began to change, not in the way the search was conducted, but in what it produced, or rather, what it didn't. Because under these conditions, shallow water, clear visibility, tight search grids, there's usually a moment where something appears, a sign, a trace, something that confirms the starting point. But here, that moment didn't come. And as the search continued, that absence began to stand out, quietly at first. Then, more clearly. Everything about the setup had suggested this search would be straightforward, not easy, but possible. Yet the water remained the same, clear, undisturbed and empty. That's where the first real question begins to form. A question nobody is asking loudly, and not a conclusion either. Because with conditions like these, how does someone disappear like that without leaving anything behind? At the moment, investigators are looking at the environment. Because in cases like this, the water isn't just a setting, it's a system. And that system usually behaves in ways that are understood, predictable, even if not perfectly controlled. So the first step isn't to challenge the story, it's to compare it to the place where it's supposed to have happened. The waters around the Sea of Abaco are not like the open ocean. They don't carry the same unpredictability. They don't behave with the same force. Locals describe it differently, not as something dangerous by default, but as something manageable. It is calm more often than not, clear enough that, on most days, the surface doesn't hide what's beneath it. From above, you can see down, clearly enough to track shapes, movement, change in the water color, or any change at all. And that clarity is important for this case because it changes expectations. In darker, deeper water, objects disappear quickly. They sink out of view. They move without being seen. But here that process slows down. Things remain visible longer. They drift in ways that can be followed. They don't just vanish without leaving some indication behind. And that's where the first contrast begins. Because the conditions described in the original account don't fully match what this environment is known for. Brian described rough water, strong wind, and limited visibility. An environment where control is difficult and observation becomes unreliable. But multiple people in the area that evening described something else. Neither chaos nor instability, but calm. The kind of calm where boats move steadily, where the surface isn't breaking apart into waves, where visibility isn't reduced to the point of disorientation. And this contrast isn't subtle. It changes everything about how an event like this would unfold. In rough water, movement becomes unpredictable. A fall can happen suddenly. Visibility drops. Recovery becomes more difficult. But in calm water, movement slows. Balance is easier to maintain. And if something does enter the water, it doesn't immediately disappear into confusion. It stays within view, at least for a moment, sometimes longer. And there's another factor. Currents. In the Sea of Abaco, currents don't behave like strong ocean pulls that carry objects far away within minutes. They move gradually, measured. If something enters the water, it doesn't instantly leave the area. It remains within a contained space before drifting outward over time, which means, in the early stages, minutes, even hours, the expectation is proximity, not distance. If Lynette entered the water under these conditions, then in those first moments she should have been somewhere visible, somewhere within reach, somewhere that could be tracked, even if only briefly. And then there's activity. This isn't an isolated stretch of ocean. Boats move through these waters regularly. People travel between shore and anchored vessels throughout the day and into the evening. That creates exposure. More movement would equal more visibility. More opportunities for something to be noticed, even unintentionally. But no such observation was reported. No passing boat described seeing anything unusual. No one reported movement in the water that matched the moment described. There's one more layer investigators consider. Pattern. Not just what happened here, but what usually happens in similar conditions. Because cases like this don't exist in isolation. They follow trends, outcomes that repeat often enough to form expectations. In water like this, shallow, clear, active, recovery tends to happen. Not always immediately, but within a time frame that investigators understand. Objects surface, drift, settle. They appear somewhere. And that expectation isn't theoretical. It's based on repetition. Cases where the environment behaves the way it's known to, where time and movement lead to a result. But here, that sequence never begins. The environment remains consistent. Clear water, stable conditions, contained space. But the outcome doesn't follow. Nothing appears. Nothing drifts into view. Nothing settles into a place where it can be found. And that creates tension between two things: the story and the setting. Because if the story is accurate, then the environment should respond in a certain way. And if the environment doesn't respond that way, then something doesn't align. Not as a conclusion, not yet, but as a question that begins to form beneath everything else. Because now, the water isn't just a backdrop. It's part of the analysis, a reference point. Something that can confirm or challenge what's been described. And at this stage, it's doing something subtle. It's not proving anything, but it's not supporting the story cleanly either. And that's enough to shift attention. Because when the environment doesn't match the explanation, investigators don't ignore it. They stay with it. They watch it. They test it. And they begin asking a different kind of question. Not just what happened, but whether what was described could happen here the way it was told, which leads to something that sits quietly at the edge of the investigation. If the water wasn't as dangerous as described, what exactly happened out there? At the start, the search had a clear expectation, not just to look, but to find. In situations like this, the first discovery doesn't usually take long, not necessarily the person, but something, a detail that anchors the event to the environment, a trace that confirms where to focus next. So the search continued the way it began, methodical, controlled, and built on that expectation. Boats moved across the same grids again, slow passes, tight lines, nothing left unchecked. From above, it looked precise, deliberate. Every section was accounted for, and below the surface, divers repeated those same areas. Not rushing, not assuming anything had been missed, just confirming. In water like this, visibility allows for repetition to matter. If something was overlooked once, it should be visible the second time. So they went back, same zones, same depth, same conditions, and still nothing. At that point, the absence didn't stand out yet. Searches often take time, so they adjusted, not the method, the range. The radius expanded slightly based on drift expectations, wind, current, time, all of it recalculated to determine where something might have moved. And those new zones were searched. Carefully, shorelines first, because that's where objects tend to go, edges where movement slows down, where water carries things in and leaves them there. Search teams walked those areas step by step, looking down, scanning ahead, not just for large objects, but for anything. Clothing, personal items, fragments, things that don't belong to the environment, nothing. So they moved further. Reefs. Shallow underwater structures where objects can become caught. Divers move through those spaces slowly, checking gaps, edges, places where movement might stop. Again, nothing. And that's when something started to feel different. This wasn't just a delay. It was a pattern. Each new area checked didn't bring them closer to a discovery. It repeated the same result. Empty. And that's when sonar became central. Not as a backup, but as a confirmation tool. If something wasn't visible from above, it could still be detected below. Operators monitored the screens closely, watching for any irregularity, any shape that didn't match the natural contour of the seabed, any density change that suggested something foreign. The screen stayed consistent, flat, undisturbed, no anomalies, and that result mattered. Because sonar doesn't rely on visibility, it detects structure, presence, difference. And here, it wasn't detecting anything. So the search teams kept going, not because they expected something new, but because the lack of results didn't make sense yet. They ran the grids again, not wider, just repeated, same areas, same patterns, looking for confirmation that nothing had been missed. And again, nothing. At that point, the focus began to shift slightly, not away from the search, but deeper into what the search was producing. Because now, investigators weren't just recording what they found, they were documenting what they didn't. No personal belongings recovered, no clothing identified, no flotation device, no debris consistent with an event in the water. Not even smaller items, the kind that usually drift and remain visible longer than expected, because in most cases, even when larger evidence isn't immediately found, something smaller appears first, a partial trace, an indirect sign, something that connects the environment to the event. But here, that connection wasn't forming. The water remained clear. The shorelines remained empty. The sonar remained quiet. And the longer that continued, the more unusual it became. Absence at this scale doesn't stay neutral. It starts to carry weight, not as proof of something else, but as a problem that needs to be explained. Under these conditions, shallow water, high visibility, active search, predictable drift, the expectation isn't complete disappearance, it's partial recovery, gradual discovery, something. And here, there was none. Not delayed, not missed, just absent. And that's when the absence itself becomes part of the investigation. Not as a conclusion, but as a question. If the environment didn't produce what it normally would, then either something interrupted that process, or the process never began the way it was assumed. An interesting distinction. One suggests complication. The other suggests something different entirely, and at this stage, Investigators aren't choosing between those explanations. They're holding both, continuing the search, continuing the documentation, but also recognizing something that's becoming harder to ignore. This isn't just a case where nothing has been found yet. It's a case where nothing is behaving the way it should, and that realization doesn't stop the search. It changes how the search is understood. Every empty result isn't just a delay, it's a data point. Another confirmation that the expected outcome isn't happening. And as those confirmations accumulate, they begin to shape the direction of everything that follows. Which brings the investigation to a quieter, more difficult question. If nothing surfaced, was it because nothing was there to begin with? For most of the search, all attention stayed on the water. That's where the story pointed. That's where the effort went. But at a certain point, that focus began to shift, not because something new was found, but because nothing was. And that's when investigators started looking at something that had been there the entire time, the yacht. The vessel Lynette and Brian Hooker were trying to reach, the boat named Soulmate. It hadn't moved, still anchored in the same position just offshore, exactly where it had been left. From a distance, it didn't stand out. No visible damage, no signs of distress, just a quiet boat sitting in calm water. Now, it wasn't just part of the background anymore. It became part of the investigation. Authorities began boarding the yacht as part of routine procedure. At first, this wasn't unusual. Whenever an incident involves a vessel, it's standard to check it, confirm timelines, look for anything out of place, verify what happened before and after the event. But as they stepped onto the boat, something felt different. Not because of what they found, but because of how little there was to react to. There was no indication of urgency, no sign that someone had rushed back on board in distress, no scattered items, no disruption to the space. Everything appeared settled, still. The kind of stillness you'd expect from a boat that hadn't been part of anything chaotic, and that's where the questions began to shift. Because according to the account, this boat was the destination, the point they were trying to reach when everything went wrong. Which means, if the incident happened during that final approach, this boat should sit just beyond it, just past the moment where everything changed. So, investigators started treating it that way, not just as a location, but as a reference point. They looked at the positioning, the angle of approach, the distance from shore, the time it would take to reach it under normal conditions. Every detail became part of reconstructing that final stretch. And then they turned their attention to what was on board. Items were examined, not for dramatic evidence, but for sequence. What was used, what was untouched, what might indicate when someone last arrived. Because even without obvious signs of disturbance, small details can still tell a story. But here again, the pattern held. There was nothing pointing to a sudden, chaotic arrival. Nothing suggested that someone had made it back to the yacht in a state of emergency. There were no clear markers of urgency. And that absence confirmed reality. If the boat represents where they were heading, and nothing on that boat reflects a crisis, then, whatever happened, didn't leave a trace there either, which creates a new kind of tension. Now there are two places connected to this story: the water, where nothing was found, and the boat, where nothing appears to have happened. And when both ends of the story come back empty, the space in between becomes harder to define. That's when the yacht stops being just a destination. It becomes a boundary, a fixed point in a timeline that no longer fits cleanly around it. If everything unfolded just before reaching this boat, you would expect some reflection of that moment, either in the water or on the vessel itself, but neither shows it. And that leaves investigators looking at the same object in a different way, not as a place they were going, but as a place that might tell them what didn't happen. which leads to a question that quietly reshapes the entire sequence. With the boat untouched and the water telling a story of absence, where did Lynette truly go missing? Between the shore and the yacht, there was only one way across, not a long stretch of water, not a complicated route, just a short transfer. And that transfer depended on a single object, the dinghy, small, functional, easy to control. The kind of boat used every day in places like Sea of Abaco to move back and forth between land and anchored vessels. According to the original account, this is where everything happened, not on the yacht, not on shore, but in this small space, somewhere between the two, which makes the dinghy more than just part of the story. It becomes the point where the story is supposed to make sense. So investigators turned their attention to it. At first, its role seemed straightforward. It was the last place Lynette was known to be, the setting of the incident, the final controlled environment before the water. But then something changed, because when authorities began tracking the dinghy itself, it wasn't where it was expected to be. It wasn't secured next to the yacht. It wasn't positioned at the dock. It was gone, at least temporarily, which immediately raised a different kind of question, not about what happened in the water, but about what happened to the vessel that was there at the time. Eventually, the dinghy was located, not far away, but not where it should have been either. It had drifted, carried by the same conditions that were already being questioned, and when it was recovered, investigators didn't treat it as just a missing boat. They treated it like evidence. They looked at what was inside, for signs, small details, items that might indicate sequence. Positioning, usage, movement, what had been used, what hadn't. Because in a situation where something goes wrong that quickly, you expect some kind of disruption, something out of place, a sign that control was lost. But here, the condition of the dinghy didn't clearly reflect that. There was no obvious damage, no clear indication of a violent or chaotic event. It didn't look like something that had been part of a sudden, uncontrolled accident. And that's where the focus began to shift again. Because the dinghy doesn't just tell you where something happened, it tells you how movement occurred, where someone started, where they were heading, what happened in between. And here, that sequence didn't sit cleanly. The boat left one place, failed to reach another, and ended up somewhere else entirely, which introduces timing. Because for the dinghy to drift, certain conditions have to be in place. Time has to pass. Movement has to occur without control, and the path it takes should align with everything else, the wind, the current, the timeline already being established. But when those pieces are compared, they don't settle easily. The movement of the dinghy becomes its own question, not just where it was found, but how it got there and when that movement started. Because if the dinghy behaved naturally, its path should be predictable. But if it didn't, then something about that journey doesn't match the story attached to it. And now, this small boat, the simplest part of the situation, becomes one of the most important, because it connects everything, shore to yacht, timeline to location, account to reality. And if that connection doesn't hold, the rest of the sequence starts to loosen with it, which brings everything back to one moment, the one place where this was all supposed to happen. Inside that dinghy, between 2 points that are close enough to see, but far enough apart to leave questions behind. And the more that movement is examined, the harder it becomes to follow it cleanly, which leads to a question that doesn't stay contained to the boat itself. If the dinghy didn't behave the way the story suggested, what actually happened during that trip? At first, the search followed a plan. But when nothing appeared, the plan didn't stop. It stretched. Search teams began expanding the radius around the reported location, slowly at first, then wider with each passing cycle. Not randomly. Every adjustment was calculated. Wind direction, tide movement. Time elapsed. All of it fed into drift models, designed to answer a simple question. If something entered the water there, Where should it be now? So the search moved outward in rings, from the initial point to nearby shallows, channels described, edges where current slows, to shorelines where objects tend to collect. Each zone had a purpose. Each one represented a place where something should have ended up. And one by one, those places were checked. Shorelines first. Search teams walked the edges of nearby land, looking for anything that might have washed in, not just large objects, small ones too, fragments, clothing, anything that might drift and settle. Nothing. Then reefs, areas beneath the surface where objects sometimes become caught. Divers moved through those sections carefully, scanning spaces where visibility was still strong enough to detect changes. Again, nothing. Then, nearby islands. Locations where wind and current patterns often guide floating objects over time. Those were checked as well. Still nothing. And then, something changed. Because at this point, it wasn't just that they hadn't found anything. It was that the expected outcomes weren't happening at all. The models said one thing, the environment suggested another, but the results didn't follow either. So investigators began looking deeper into the conditions, not just where something should drift, but what could affect that movement. Marine life was considered, not in theory, but in pattern. In coastal areas like Sea of Abaco, marine activity follows predictable behavior. Smaller fish tend to gather in shallow areas, especially around reefs and structures. Larger marine animals, when present, move through specific zones, not randomly across open water. And importantly, that activity doesn't erase evidence instantly. It alters it, breaks it down over time, but rarely removes all trace without leaving anything behind. In similar cases, even when marine life is a factor, something still surfaces. Fragments, material, items that separate and drift independently. Because water movement and biological activity don't work in isolation. They interact, which means even if something is affected below the surface, other elements tend to rise, spread, or move into visible areas. Anything that suggests something entered the system and was processed by it. But here, that pattern didn't appear. No partial recovery, no secondary trace that would indicate interaction below the surface. And that's what investigators were watching for. Environmental factors were layered in as well. Water temperature, salinity, movement over time, all of it analyzed to understand whether something could disappear completely under these circumstances. But even with those variables accounted for, the pattern didn't change. No recovery, no trace. No confirmation that anything had followed the path it was supposed to. And that's when the search stopped being about coverage and started becoming about contradiction. Because every new area checked should have increased the chance of finding something. Instead, it reinforced the same result, nothing. And that repetition began to matter. At this point, the search itself was no longer the only focus. The assumptions behind the search were. Everything up to now had been built on one idea, that Lynette entered the water at that location and followed a path that could be tracked. But when every predicted endpoint comes back empty, that idea starts to weaken. Not suddenly, but steadily. And once that happens, the investigation doesn't just expand, it shifts. If every expected outcome failed, was the original assumption wrong? For days, the search followed a pattern, outward, across the water, expanding, adjusting, repeating. Each pass built on the last, guided by drift models, environmental data, and the assumption that everything began and ended in the sea. And at first, that pattern made sense, until it didn't. Because after a certain point, the search wasn't just coming up empty. It was repeating the same emptiness, the same grids, the same routes, the same results. Nothing. And that's when something subtle began to change, not all at once, not in a way that would stand out immediately, But if you were watching closely, the rhythm shifted. Some of the search boats that had been covering wide sections of water started slowing down, not stopping, just not repeating the same patterns with the same urgency. Certain zones that had been checked multiple times were no longer being revisited as often. The outward expansion paused, and instead of pushing further into open water, attention started pulling inward, closer to land. At first, it didn't look like a major adjustment, just small movements. Investigators marking areas that hadn't been central before, not shorelines where objects drift, but access points, paths, spaces connected to movement, how someone travels, not how something floats. And then, something new appeared, not in the water, on land, cadaver dogs. They weren't brought in for shoreline scanning. They weren't following tidal patterns. They were guided through specific areas, places selected based on proximity, timing, and possible movement. This is huge, and here's why. Cadaver dogs aren't used to search open water environments in this way. They're used when there's reason to believe something might be on land or connected to land, and their presence marked a clear shift, even if it wasn't publicly framed that way. At this stage, the investigation was no longer just trying to recover something from the water. It was trying to understand what happened. That's a different process. Recovery follows expectation. Investigation follows uncertainty. And uncertainty had started to take over. Investigators began reviewing movement patterns that had nothing to do with drift. Routes from the inn to the dock. Access points between shore and water. Areas where someone could move without being immediately noticed. Not theoretical paths, real ones. On foot, in real time. Within the window already being examined, and this wasn't about replacing the water search. It was an expansion beyond it. Given that the original assumption that Lynette entered the water and remained part of that environment was no longer holding cleanly against the results. Too many expected outcomes had failed. Too many areas had come back empty. So instead of continuing to push that assumption further, they stepped outside of it. And when that happens in an investigation, it doesn't mean they found something new. It means they're starting to question the foundation of what they were told. And that shift isn't always announced. It doesn't come with a clear statement. It shows up in decisions, where resources go, what gets prioritized, what gets left behind. And here, those decisions were visible. Less emphasis on open water grids, more attention to areas connected to movement, timing, and access. A quiet transition from searching where something should be to asking whether it was ever there at all. Once that question enters the investigation, everything widens. The timeline matters more. The route matters more. The moments between known points become more important than the location itself. And the water, once the center of everything, becomes just one possibility among others, which leaves investigators standing between two directions, one that follows the original account and one that starts to move away from it. And at this point, both can't be true at the same time. So the investigation continues, but not in the same way it began, not just outward, but inward, across land, across movement, across possibilities that weren't part of the original story. And once that shift happens, it doesn't reverse. The question is no longer about where to look, it's about what to believe. It leads to one that becomes harder to ignore the longer the search continues. Why would a search for someone lost at sea move on to land? By this point, the search had done more than cover ground. It had tested expectations, not just once, but repeatedly. And every time, those expectations led to the same place. Nothing. But in investigations like this, there's always a reference point. Not a guess, not a theory, a pattern. Because situations like this don't happen in isolation. They've happened before, in similar waters, under similar conditions. And when they do, they tend to follow a sequence. Something enters the water. And over time, something returns. Not always immediately, but within a window that investigators understand. Sometimes it's an object. Sometimes it's clothing. Sometimes it's something much smaller than expected. But there's usually a point where the environment gives something back, and that expectation doesn't come from assumption. It comes from repetition, from cases where recovery follows movement, where drift leads to edges, where time brings things into view. And here, that sequence never started. Days passed, then more days, and the water remained the same, clear, contained, active, but still empty. And that's when investigators began comparing what they were seeing to what they should have seen, because the conditions here weren't working against recovery. They were working in its favor. Shallow depth, consistent visibility, predictable movement patterns, all of it pointing toward the same outcome. Something should have appeared, even if not immediately, even if not exactly where expected. At some point, something should have surfaced, drifted, or settled into a place where it could be found. So they looked again, not just at the water, but at the pathways that water creates. Shorelines were revisited carefully, step by step, watching the edges where objects tend to collect, places where current slows and movement ends. Those edges remained clear. Reefs were checked again, areas beneath the surface where objects sometimes become caught, held in place long enough to be noticed, still nothing. And then the focus returned to the models, the calculations that had been guiding the search from the beginning: wind, current, time, all of it layered together to predict where something should be. Those models didn't point everywhere. They pointed somewhere, specific zones, predictable endpoints. And those endpoints had already been searched multiple times, without result, which meant the issue wasn't coverage, it was outcome. Since the expected outcome simply wasn't happening, the absence began to take on a different weight, not as a delay, but as a pattern of its own. Experts reviewing the situation didn't focus on what was missing at first. They focused on what should have been present. And as time passed, that gap became harder to reconcile. Because in an environment like this, complete disappearance is not typical. Not under these conditions. Not with this level of visibility. Not with the tools being used. And once that question enters the investigation, everything changes. Because now, the absence isn't just unexplained, it's inconsistent. And inconsistencies don't resolve themselves. They point somewhere else. This opens a question that now sits at the center of everything. If everything points to a recovery that never happened, what does that suggest about where she actually is? At the beginning, everything pointed to the water. That was the center. That's where the story started. That's where the search focused. So every question followed the same direction. Where in the water? How far could she have moved? What could have carried her? And for a while, those questions made sense. Until they didn't. Because every path through that explanation led to the same place. Nothing. No recovery, no trace, no confirmation that anything had unfolded the way it was described. And when that happens, the problem isn't the search, it's the story. Because the water did what it always does. It stayed consistent, shallow, clear, and predictable. The search did what it was supposed to do. It covered the area, repeated it, expanded it, tested every outcome, and still, nothing changed. At that point, the focus can't stay the same. Because now, the question is no longer, where is she? It becomes, what actually happened? The water is no longer the answer. It becomes a possibility, just one of several. The yacht, no longer just a destination. It becomes a fixed point in a timeline that doesn't fit cleanly around it. The dinghy, no longer just transportation. It becomes movement that doesn't fully align with the story attached to it. And the search, once moving outward across the water, begins turning inward, toward land, toward roots, toward moments that weren't part of the original explanation. Because when every expected outcome fails, you don't keep forcing the same conclusion. You step outside of it. And that's the turning point. Not a discovery, not a confession, a realization that the version of events that started this case no longer holds together. Not cleanly, not completely. Too many gaps, too many contradictions, too many things that should have happened, but didn't. And once that realization settles in, it doesn't go away, because now every detail is seen differently. Every movement re-examined, every assumption questioned. The case doesn't stop, but it no longer follows the same path. And the question that replaces everything else isn't one that can be ignored, because it sits at the center of all of it, unresolved, unanswered, unavoidable. If Lynette Hooker didn't disappear in the water, then what really happened that night? We monitor true crime stories that you shouldn't miss, bringing you the main parts other people may have missed. You should subscribe now so you never miss anything.